Good morning and welcome to Worldwide Wisdom. The story of Purim is actually a story of modern times. You're not talking about any overt miracles. You know what's deafening about Purim story is that the silence is deafening when it comes to the miracle. Like, what was the miracle of the Purim story? There wasn't any. There was no miracle that was explicit and overt in the Purim story because Purim is just an unfolding of events. It's an unlikely palace intrigue where it just so happened to be this way, just so happened to be that way, and something else, and the queen was there at the right time, at the right place. Bim bam, the Jews were saved. Purim is the hidden hand of God as opposed to other miracles, which were explicit, clear, and unmistakable. Now, most people are familiar with the Purim story as the following executive summary, where Haman tried to commit genocide against the Jews. Queen Esther was in the palace, right? Mordechai had something to do with it. She appealed to the king. And what happened was that the king had a change of heart and he hung Haman instead of Mordechai, and they lived happily ever after. That's pretty much the executive summary of Purim. But let's go behind the scenes today with the Talmud. Let's understand the backdrop of the Purim story to understand what really was going on behind the scenes, because really what was happening back then was one of the most unsettling eras of Jewish history. You see, several decades prior to the Purim story, the Jewish people were at the zenith of their power. Zenith means the height, right? They were at the zenith of their power. Zenith.
In English.
In South Africa, we say zenith.
Like we say zebra, we say zebra.
Anytime I don't pronounce something properly, I say that's how we say it in South Africa. Okay, so they were at the zenith of their power. What happened? Moses had led the Jewish people out of Egypt. The year was 2,448 since creation. They received the Torah that same year. 40 years later, they entered the Promised Land in the year 2488. Then, since creation, right? Then they spent about 500 years through the era of the judges. You know, you've heard of Samson, you've heard of, the various prophets, Devorah, and so on and so forth. They went through the various prophets, the judges, until eventually they ran into the era of the kings, where the prophet Samuel anoints King Saul, the first king of Israel, who then anoints King David. King David, I said right? King David, and then the son of King David is King Saul. Now, King Saul is the one, King Solomon, forgive me. King Solomon, take it slow. King Solomon, he's the one who builds the first temple, which lasts for 410 years, if I'm not mistaken, until the arrival of the Babylonians, the Iraqis. The Iraqis, they come under the leadership of the brutal tyrant Nebuchadnezzar and his bloodthirsty butcher general Nebuzaradan, and they massacre the Jews. They destroy the first temple. It is the lowest moment in Jewish history. The survivors are then taken captive into Babylon, where Babylon is where the Jews are now. Now, the good news, the bad news was that everything was destroyed and the people were killed and the temple was destroyed and the land was exiled and so on and so forth. But the good news was a chilling prophecy by the prophet Jeremiah. Now, Jeremiah was a prophet that when he spoke, people listened. Why was that? Because he was the one who initially foretold the doom of Jerusalem. He was the one who had prophesied years earlier that if the Jews don't repent, then the king will come from the north, he said, and he will destroy Jerusalem and take you all captive and so on and so forth. So when people saw the unfolding of the prophecies of Jeremiah, they understood that this guy really was legit and he knew what he was talking about. While they were being exiled out of Jerusalem, he came up with another prophecy. And what that prophecy was, 70 years. He came up with the 70-year prophecy that 70 years after the fall of Jerusalem, God will remember Jerusalem and she will be rebuilt. So they knew that they were on a limited time in exile. Now, this was comforting to the Jews and devastating to their oppressors, because their oppressors understood that this guy Jeremiah knew what he was talking about. And therefore, they were all very afraid of the 70-year prophecy. The problem was that the prophecy was vague and ambiguous. It was not clear about when the times began, the 70 years time began. And that's the Gemara, the Talmud, that I'd like to share with you, which is the inside, the backstory, behind the scenes of the Purim story. Because remember, the Purim story begins with this wild feast of Achashverosh in the 3rd year of his reign. We don't know why he was making a feast. The Talmud now is going to share with us the backdrop to that story and the various erroneous calculations that the kings, the oppressors of Israel, made when they were celebrating this feast. So let's take a look at the story, okay? In those days, this is the 2nd verse of the Megillah. In those days when the king sat. So the Megillah opens up. It wasn't there of Achashverosh who ruled from Ethiopia to India. That's quite a distance, 127 provinces. When the king sat is the 2nd verse of the Megillah. What does it mean that he sat? It would mean that it was the beginning of his reign. But then it continues to say that it was in the 3rd year of his reign that he sat. Why was he sitting comfortably on his throne only in the 3rd year of his reign? What happened in the first 2 years? Rabbi said, what is the meaning of when he sat? It was after his mind was put at ease. The Gemara we're learning, by the way, is the Gemara Megillah, which is the Megillah of Purim, Megillah of Esther. It's folio 11b, in case you'd like to follow inside. After his mind was put at ease in the 3rd year with regard to the fate of his Jewish subjects, he celebrated with a great feast. Why? What had happened? The prophet Jeremiah had foretold that the Jews would be redeemed from their Babylonian exile after 70 years. Quote, Jeremiah chapter 29, verse 10, for thus said God, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I shall remember you to return you to this place. However, Jeremiah did not clarify how these 70 years would be calculated. Each of the Gentile kings who ruled the Jews in this exile was aware of Jeremiah's prophecy and with great anxiety awaited the deadline, each according to his own calculation. Thus, the passing of those 70 years with the Jews still a subject nation, was cause for celebration. So any king who was ruling over the Jews at that time and who, according to his calculation, felt that the 70 years had passed was a reason for celebration. And this is the introduction of the Megillah, it's the opening scene. Why was it that in the 3rd year of the reign of Achashverosh, he suddenly felt comfortable upon his throne? Because now he felt that the 70 years had come and gone, and this was reason to celebrate. Because he had calculated the years of 70 years had finished. Now, let's take a look. What the Gemara is going to get into. Achashverosh said, Belshazzar was the former king of Babylon, the king who ruled before Achashverosh. Remember, I'll explain to you in a moment what happened.
Is it Babylon or Persia?
Okay, so what happened was Babylon conquered Jerusalem. But Babylon didn't last very long. It lasted about 52 years. The kingdom of Babylon lasted about 52 years after the fall of Jerusalem, until it was conquered by Cyrus and Darius, the Persians and the Medes together. The Persians and the Medes, they made an alliance together to conquer Babylon, and that was the end of the Babylonian Empire. The Persian and Median Empire then united under Achashverosh. Right? So there's a series of kings which I'll explain to you in a few minutes, okay? So just bear with me a moment, okay? So Belshazzar, Achashverosh said that Belshazzar, the former king of Babylon of the previous empire, erred. He calculated the 70 years of exile, but he erred in his calculation. However, I calculated the 70 years, concluding that now in the 3rd year of my reign they are complete, and I have not erred in my conclusion. So you see there's 2 kings, 2 calculations, and you'll see this. Belshazzar also made a feast, a very famous feast that you'll learn about in a few moments. So what happened with Belshazzar? Now just to give you a timeline, Nebuchadnezzar was the first king of Babylon, right? His son was evil Merodach. Nebuchadnezzar ruled in the years 3319 from creation until 3363 from creation. So remember, when the Jews came out of Egypt, it was 2448. Almost 1,000 years later, because remember, it took about 500 years until they built the temple, and then the temple lasted about 410 years, right? So it's about 1,000 years after they come out of Egypt. 3319 was the beginning of the rule of Nebuchadnezzar until 3363. He destroyed Jerusalem. His son, whose name was Evil Merodach, that was actually his name, Evil Merodach, but didn't speak English. That didn't matter. So he ruled from 3363 until 3386. His son, which would be the 3rd king of Babylon, was Belshazzar, who ruled from 3386 until 3389, just for 3 years, until he was defeated by Darius the Mede and Cyrus of Persia. Okay, the one who ruled after them was Achashverosh. Now, What was Belshazzar's reckoning? And how did he err? As it's written in the prophecy, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I shall remember you. That's Jeremiah 29:10. This one sentence terrified empires when Jeremiah had said that prophecy on the way out of Jerusalem. And it is written to complete the 70 years from the ruins of Jerusalem. It's a separate verse. That verse comes from Daniel.
Yeah, Daniel's important.
Right. Belshazzar understood that the 70 years for Babylon mentioned in the first verse commenced with the ascension of the first Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar to the throne. So there was, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I shall remember you. And there's a second verse that says to complete the 70 years from the ruins of Jerusalem. So the question is, when do you start counting the 7 years? From the rise of Babylon or from the fall of Jerusalem? They weren't at the same time. So Belshazzar understood that the 70 years were related to the rise of Babylon, and he therefore calculated the 70 years as follows. The 45 years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the first Babylonian emperor, and the 23 years of evil Merodach's reign, and 2 years of his own reign makes up 70 years since the founding of the kingdom of Babylon. He figured it was 70 years. The prophecy was a prophecy that was 70 years time limit, expiration date to the kingdom of Babylon. And that's why at the end of the second years of his own reign, he felt, or the second year of his reign, he felt, that's it. The 70 years have come and gone. The Jews are still not back in Jerusalem. The Jewish God must be dead. Since the Jews are still under foreign domination after the passage of these 70 years, Belshazzar concluded that Jeremiah's prophecy had been nullified. He therefore brought out the plundered vessels of the holy temple and used them at a great banquet attended by his noblemen. Anybody know what happened at that feast? No, you're talking about mixing feasts. This is Belshazzar's feast. Belshazzar the Babylonian, you're mixing your emperors. Right. That was Achashverosh's feast, the beginning of the Purim story. This story happened a couple years before the Purim story began. This is the feast of Belshazzar. Now you'll see why it's very, very famous. Correct. This is in the book of Daniel, right? By the way, the Babylonian kingdom was established in the year of 3319, which is 441 BCE, when Nebuchadnezzar deposed Esarhaddon, the king of Assyria, and assumed the throne. Assyria was the most brutal enemy our people ever faced. You don't hear much about them. Assyria was so brutal that they conquered the 10 tribes. This is before the Babylonian Empire. They conquered the 10 tribes and they exiled them so far away that 2,800 years later, we still don't know where they are. We still don't know where they are. We hear dribs and drabs from tribes in Peru and in China and in, Mongolia. And they say, yeah, we're the lost Jews. We're the tribe of Dan. We're the tribe of Manasseh. That's how good these guys were. They were advancing on Jerusalem and they were about to do the same to the remaining 2.5 tribes. Had they been successful, I don't think there would have been any Jews left. But in a miraculous evening under the rule of King Chizkiyahu, that night was the night of Passover. They all died in a mysterious plague. And that was over. And one of the only surviving soldiers was a young soldier by the name of Nebuchadnezzar, who becomes the Babylonian emperor. Right. So you got Assyrians, you've got the Babylonians, and now we're moving on to the Medians and the Persians. Right. Okay. Good. So Belshazzar ruled only for 3 years. Remember that, right? Because his kingdom ended the night of his feast. You'll see why. The banquet was occasioned by Belshazzar's military victory over Darius the Mede. Since the 70-year period had uneventfully passed, Belshazzar felt safe in making personal use of the sacred temple vessels that his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar had plundered. He brought out the holy vessels of the temple and he dressed himself in the clothing of the high priest. Can you imagine the indignation, the insult? What?
Did he have
Yeah, he wore the iPad. Now, what happened at that feast? Let me just fill you in the missing details here. What happened was at that feast, Belshazzar was essentially celebrating the end of the Jewish people. So at the feast, it was a wild orgy, and they brought out whatever they needed to bring, all the indulgences they could possibly think of, and they profaned and desecrated the holy vessels of the temple. At that feast, suddenly in the drunken stupor, they see a hand writing on the wall. The writing was on the wall. This is where the expression comes from. The writing is on the wall. It happened at this feast. Suddenly a hand appears and starts writing on the wall. And it writes letters that nobody can read. Mene, tekel, farasin. Mene is like Chinese, top to bottom. Mene, mene, tekel u'farsin. And nobody could read the letters. They were like, what does that say? So eventually they called in Daniel, who was one of the wise men who had been exiled from Jerusalem 52 years earlier. Because remember, Babylon conquered Jerusalem in the 18th year. I think it was the 18th year of his reign. I can't remember exactly which year it was, but it was not at the beginning of the rise of the Babylonian Empire. It was some decades in. So he sees the writing on the wall, and they bring in Daniel, and Daniel says like this, mene, mene, tekel u'farsin, it's Hebrew, which means measured, weighed, and divided. And he interpreted to mean the word divided also means Persians in Hebrew, parasin. So he said, measured, the sin of Babylon has been measured. Measured and weighed. This is, we have a guest from Sri Lanka. Nice to see you. Welcome. What city in Sri Lanka are you in, Ariel? So weighed and measured is the sin of the Babylonian Empire. Persians, it's time for the Persians. So he basically said that the prophecy is telling you that the Persians are going to conquer the Babylonians soon.
That night, no?
Well, soon, yeah. So obviously this is the worst nightmare of the Babylonian Emperor Belshazzar. I can't imagine that he remained drunk for too long. But anyways, he pretty much ended the party, and he ordered the palace into lockdown, the capital city into lockdown. Nobody was allowed in, and nobody was allowed out. And his instructions were such that even if someone claims to be the emperor himself, don't ask any questions, chop his head off. And that's how strict we have to be. That night, Belshazzar, like the ancient King Pharaoh, Western Australia, wow, cool. This is amazing, global, worldwide wisdom. So just like Pharaoh, who considered himself a god, and he did so by telling people that he never went to the bathroom. So what he did was he would go early in the morning when nobody was looking. He would go to the River Nile where he would nature calls. So Belshazzar did the same thing. And by the way, it's where Moses would meet him. Moses would meet him at his secret hiding spot, and he would say, "I know who you are. Okay, you can't fool me, sir. I can see what you're doing." Right? It was pretty humiliating to the deity. Belshazzar had a similar practice. He had a secret trapdoor under his bedroom where he would go down to the river to do his thing. And when he came back, he was drunk. Remember, he didn't really remember the whole story. So in the morning, he came back to the main entrance. When he comes to the main entrance, he says, "Let me in. I'm the king." Bam! They chopped his head off. And very soon, panic ensued. And the Persians who were waiting and hiding, and the Persians and the Medes were easily overran. And that was the end of the Babylonian Empire. So that ended that night, the night of his feast. Now let's keep on going in the Gemara.
Vashti was his daughter.
Vashti is part of that story. Vashti was the daughter of Belshazzar.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Apropos to Belshazzar's reckoning, the Gemara inquires. And how do we know that Nebuchadnezzar reigned for a total of 45 years? How do we know that? As Master said, they were exiled in the 7th, they were exiled in the 8th, they were exiled in the 18th, and they were exiled in the 19th. The Gemara explains the first half of this enigmatic statement refers to the different periods of the exile. The exile of the king Yoyachin occurred in the 7th year following Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jehoiakim, which was the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Don't worry about this so much. It's just the details of the various exiles of Jerusalem. The second half of the statement also refers to one exile, the exile of Tzidkiyahu occurred in the 18th year following Nebuchadnezzar's conquest of Jehoiakim. So the 18th year, which was the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Now how do we know that Nebuchadnezzar... Okay, I'm going to skip that part. Okay, whatever. Okay. I'm going to keep focus here. Now the son of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar reigned for 45 years. His son Evil Merodach ruled for 23 years. And now this guy, Belshazzar, is ruling for 2 years when he finally feels. Now, the Gemara, so now we understand why he made the mistake, because he calculated from the rise of the Babylonian Empire. The Gemara presents a calculation of Achashverosh, who sought to avoid Belshazzar's mistake. Achashverosh said, Belshazzar, the Babylonian, erred in his calculation since he chose as his starting point the year of Nebuchadnezzar's rise to power, the beginning of the Babylonian Empire. I shall calculate and not err. I've got a better accountant. Is it written in the prophecy of Jeremiah for the kingdom of Babylon? See, they're analyzing the prophecy of Jeremiah. Does it say 7 years from the kingdom of Babylon? It doesn't say that. It doesn't say that. It says, no, it's written merely for Babylon. 7 years for Babylon, not from Babylon. To what does for Babylon then refer? To the exile of Babylon. In other words, it's 7 years from the time that the Jews were exiled to Babylon. That's when the 7 years starts, 18 years later. Thus, how many years must be deleted from Belshazzar's calculation, which began with the year Nebuchadnezzar ascended to the throne? The answer is 8 years. The 8, because that's the beginning of the first exile, when the first group of Jews went off to Babylon. 8 years of Nebuchadnezzar's reign before he exiled Yehoiachin must be deleted. So Achashverosh calculated and inserted these other years in place of the 8 deleted years as follows. He added another 8 years. 1 year remaining of Belshazzar's reign, which Belshazzar did not include in his own calculation. And the 5 years of Darius the Mede and Cyrus of Persia, they ruled together. And then 2 years of his own reign, which means here is the 7 years from the exile of Yehoiachin, the first of the Jewish exiles. So he says the 3rd year of his own reign is finally safe. And that's why the opening words of the Megillah is that the king Achashverosh, who ruled across the whole world, only sat on his throne in the 3rd year of his reign. Now, because they were calculating with the prophecy of Jeremiah, after the date predicted for redemption passed, Achashverosh followed the example of Belshazzar. He says, since Achashverosh saw that the 7 years were completed and the Jews were not redeemed, he said, now certainly they will never be redeemed. Because Jeremiah's prophecy was not fulfilled, he therefore brought out the sacred vessels of the holy temple and used them at a lavish royal banquet. This didn't work well the first time. As a punishment for his insolence, the Satan came and danced amongst them and killed Vashti.
Satan.
Well, what provoked Achashverosh to want to kill Vashti? It was because there was a debate amongst the men about who are the most beautiful women in the world. This one said, our woman, their woman, these women, those women, until the king couldn't stand it. And he said, no, my wife is the most beautiful in the world. She was actually a Babylonian, Vashti. My wife is the most beautiful, and I'm going to prove it to you. She's going to dance naked. I'm going to send for her to come dance naked. And then she actually would have wanted to dance naked, by the way.
Sure.
She would have wanted to. She would force the Jewish maidens that she enslaved to work naked for her. Texas, cool. This is great. Love it. So she would abuse the Jewish slaves, the female slaves, to work naked for her. So she had no problem with nakedness. The problem was the Medrash tells us that she grew some sort of an appendage, like a tail, or maybe she broke out in a rash, pimples, whatever. Something happened that was inappropriate for her to appear disrobed in front of the man, and therefore she was insolent to the king. This is all the working of the Satan, who set up the conversation, who set up Achashverosh to feel indignated, to say, no, my wife is the most beautiful, to provoke her to stand up to her husband. This is all the Satan's work behind the scenes, okay?
And
now,
the insolence was logical too, because she was a daughter of a king, and Ahasuerus was a stable boy.
Right, and she actually sent a message. He was a stable boy in Belshazzar's stables, but he was an enterprising entrepreneur, this guy. He clearly rose the ranks. He climbed the corporate ladder. But she was the daughter of Belshazzar, who was left alive when the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon. They left her alive for whatever reason, because they wanted to keep a royal blood alive. She sent the message, you're so drunk, you're not even a nothing to my father. My father could drink 1,000 goblets of wine and keep his cool. You drank a few cups, and now you've totally lost it. That didn't go well. He didn't like it. Okay. Just one quick summary I want to give you of here. The sequence of events, right? Just a sequence of events here, guys. In summary, the kingdom of Babylon was founded in 3319 since creation, when Nebuchadnezzar deposed the king of Ashur and ascended to the throne. 1 year later, the Babylonian domination of the Jewish people began when the mighty legions of Nebuchadnezzar overwhelmed King Yehoiakim and his forces. Remember, there was only 2.5 tribes of the Jews remaining after the Assyrians had exiled the first 10 tribes. 7 years later, in 3327 since creation, the first mass waves of exiles, including the greatest scholars and leaders of the Jewish nation, were taken to Babylon. So this would have been the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar, even though the domination of the Jews began in the second year. In the second year of Babylon, right? But still, the conquest, the exile to Babylon began in the 8th year. Along with Jehoiachin, the son of Joachim, their king. Called the exile of Jehoiachin, this first exile expulsion occurred in the 8th year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. 11 years later, this is going to be very important to understand this 11 years later. Right? 11 years later, in 3338, the Babylonian army swept across the Jewish kingdom, this time ravaging the temple. Very important to understand that, because that's going to be the correct calculation. Since the fall of the temple, 11 years after Achashverosh's erroneous calculation, and driving King Tzidkiyahu and his people into exile. This misfortune took place in the 19th year of Nebuchadnezzar's rule, 18 years after Yehoiakim was captured. Now, it's going to be very important to understand that piece. So you got 3 calculations. Belshazzar calculated 7 years from the rise of the Babylonian Empire. Achashverosh calculated the 7 years from the first exile, which happened 8 years later. The real answer was 11 years after that, which was really 18 years since the rise of the Babylonian Empire, when the temple was destroyed. And that's the enigma that Jeremiah failed to clarify deliberately. He deliberately kept it ambiguous so nobody would know, because you don't want to make prophecies. Whenever you prophesize, you don't want to keep it too obvious. You want to give them what to think about. So Achashverosh was very, very mistaken, right? Now, what's the mistake of Achashverosh? Achashverosh said, Belshazzar erred in his calculation since he chose as his starting point the year of the Nebuchadnezzar's rise to power. I shall calculate and shall not err. Is it written in the prophecy of... Did I do this? I think I did this right. I did this right. Okay, fine. So after they predicted for redemption past, Achashverosh followed the example of Belshazzar, and he brought the holy vessels and he profaned them at his feast. Now the Gemara asks, but Achashverosh appears to have calculated correctly. If so, why was the deliverance delayed another 11 years until the Jews came to Israel 11 years later? The answer was by calculating the 7 years from the exile of Yehoiachin, the first exile Achashverosh also erred, for he should have counted the 7 years from the destruction of Jerusalem, which occurred 11 years after Yehoiachin was exiled. Okay. Now, I want to point out the following. So what actually happened in the end here was that why did Achashverosh hate the Jews so much? Why was he so willing to depose the Jews when Haman offers him 10,000 talents of silver to commit genocide? I mean, that's a very serious offense. The reason was because Achashverosh was extremely insecure about the Jews. He was extremely insecure about the Jews. Remember, the 3rd year of his reign is when he threw this feast. Esther becomes queen in the 7th year of his reign. Haman shows up in the 12th year of his reign. So he was insecure about the whole thing. So what happened was when he was afraid that the Jews were going to take over his kingdom based on the prophecy of Jeremiah. So when he heard that somebody was willing to do the dirty work for him, he's like, no problem, you do it and don't worry about payment. Be my pleasure to grant you this decree. But what happened when Esther appeals to the king and she says, listen, somebody's trying to kill me and my people, and Achashverosh is like, what? Who's trying to kill you and your people? And she says, him, Haman. No, sorry. I'm between. Haman. So he says, really, it suddenly dawns on Achashverosh that his own wife is a Jew. He never knew that. It was a secret. And when he realizes that his own wife is a Jew, he realizes that their son, Darius II, is a Jew. So then he realized, 1 second, when it means that the Jews are going to rule after me, the prophecy is my own son. I have no problem with my own son, really. That's fine. And that's why he just switched immediately, just switched over. And he said, no problem, we'll just hang Haman. Like this guy, he was so willing to sell the Jews out for nothing, right? Throw them under the bus and genocide. Suddenly he's like, oh, it's him, no problem, we'll just kill him. Because his animosity just totally ebbed when he realized that it was his own son that was going to be the king, the next king of his empire. So suddenly all his anti-Semitism disappeared, kills Haman, and now what happens is Darius soon rises to the throne. Darius the Persian rises to the throne. Remember, Achashverosh became king in the year 3393. Darius, Esther's son, rises to power in 3407, which is 14 years later. He rises to power in the 14th, in the 14 years later after Achashverosh, right? And one of the first things that he does, Darius, by the way, was also known as Cyrus, because remember, those two kings, it's like the name Pharaoh. When you become something really important, you have to adopt the name of some, Pharaoh the first, Pharaoh the second, like, they do that. So there were these certain names that people would adopt. Now, since Darius and Cyrus were the Persians and the Mede rulers of that took over Babylon, these were both royal names. So he was known both as Darius and as Cyrus. So when we talk about Cyrus the Great, who sent the Jews back to sponsor them to rebuild the second temple, we're talking about the son of Esther and Achashverosh. We're talking about Darius, right? That's who this guy is. So when President Trump was called by Mike Pompeo, Secretary of State, when he called him Cyrus, what he meant was he was referring to this story. When President Trump in the first first reign,
First iteration.
first, what do they call it? First presidency, right? When he recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and he moved the embassy, that's when Pompeo said that he's Cyrus. What was he talking about? Some about a Gentile, a non-Jew who has the wisdom and the vision and the courage to be able to recognize the Jewish homeland and Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish people. It was actually quite an interesting historic correlation to compare Cyrus to Trump. I mean, whatever, without getting political right now. But it doesn't matter. I'm not getting political right now, but I'm just saying the historical connection is beautiful, where you had an ancient emperor who didn't know that he was Jewish, because Cyrus actually was Jewish. He just didn't practice as a Jew because it was probably too dangerous for Esther to tell her husband that, by the way, our son is keeping Shabbos. So, that was a little complicated.
Did he have a bris?
I don't know. I never checked. I don't know.
Wait, check. Cyrus's mother was Esther.
Esther, yeah.
But he knew that Esther was a Jew.
Right. Yeah, but I don't know how he identified. I'm not sure how Darius identified. Did he identify as a Jew? Did he identify as a Persian? It sounds like when you read historical books and you see the tombs and the writings and Darius II, it's all very Persian, not so Jewish, right? I don't see Shema Yisrael written on his tombstone. But anyways, bottom line is that what happened in the end here is that the edict of Cyrus was to send the Jews back from Persia to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. And that happened when? 70 years exactly to the fall of Jerusalem, not to the rise of Babylon, like Belshazzar erroneously calculated, and not 70 years to the first exile, the first wave of exiles, the exile of Joachim the king, which happened 8 years after that, but rather what happened 14 years later than that, which was the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And it was 70 years since that event that the Jewish people are now sent back to Jerusalem to build their temple, sponsored and protected by the Iranians. Right? This is actually interesting. The Gemara says that the Iranians have a special merit. The Persians, the Iranians do have a special merit. And I remember reading the Gemara that they have some sort of a merit that they will be able to be the last war before the coming of Mashiach. They'll be the last holdout before the coming of Mashiach because they have this extraordinary merit that they were the ones that were responsible for the rebuilding of our temple. They actually made it happen. Let me just see if there's anything else I want to share with you here in this piece of Talmud, which is such a beautiful piece of Talmud that really comes and gives us so much context to the backdrop of the Purim story, where you realize it's like a little scene or sequence of scenes, which is part of a far greater picture that started with Moses and ultimately Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar destroying our temple, which then, by the way, the end of the story, what happens in the rest of the story? They go back, they rebuild the temple. And that's when Ezra and Nehemiah, they go out and they rebuild the temple, and there's the establishment of the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And now you're starting to see the emergence of the Talmud, the centers of learning. There's the Jerusalem Talmud, obviously in Israel, but then there's the center of learning moving to Babylon. And the Babylonian Talmud, which is what we're learning right now, the Babylonian Talmud, the center of Jewish life and learning slowly moves over to Babylon. Why? Because with the rise of the Romans in the land of Israel, because remember, who took over the Persians in the land of Israel? It was the Greeks who conquered the Persians, and then the Romans conquered the Greeks. Right? The Romans conquered the Greeks. So what happens now is in the land of Israel, life becomes unbearable when Constantine adopts Christianity as his official religion, and he ramps up anti-Semitism to intolerable levels. So what happens then is that the Jews flee the land of Israel and they move to Babylon, which makes Babylon the center of Jewish learning, which is why the Babylonian Talmud is far more famous and important than the Jerusalem Talmud. Ultimately, this leads to a period where the temple is built in the land of Israel, and the Greeks come in and they try to conquer it. They do, and they conquer it in the Hanukkah story, where they defile the oils, but they don't destroy it. It was only later, the next empire, the Romans, who come on in and actually destroy it, and we're still trying to rebuild it ever since. But you see the sequence from Egyptians to Babylonians to Persians, which is the Purim story, and then on to the Greeks, and the Romans, understanding the greater context, the historical context, and the chilling spiritual context of the prophecy of Jeremiah, that when he says that the temple will be rebuilt, it was actually rebuilt exactly at the time. Now, a few things come out of this. A few thoughts, closing thoughts here, folks. Number one, I want you to realize when you read about the Jews going to this feast, what kind of travesty it was for them to attend this feast. What a travesty it was for the Jews to attend this feast, even though the food is kosher. Can you imagine attending a feast which is celebrating the death of Judaism? I mean, that's just awful. That's absolutely awful. What a stab in the back of God. And that's why the Gemara says that they asked Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, why were the Jews worthy of genocide in the Purim story? And Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says because they enjoyed that feast of Achashverosh. What's the big sin of enjoying the feast of Achashverosh? The food is kosher. What's the problem?
Why was the food kosher?
Because it says in the Megillah, the food is kosher. I forget the exact word. Kedas. Each person was given food to order. That's what it says. They're given food to order in the royal palace, and they spared no expense. They ordered the food from from kosher, a real kosher place, right? Oh, so that's exactly the Purim story. That's exactly the Purim story. So let me just say this. So first of all, why were they worthy of genocide? Is because when we turn our backs on God, then God turns his back on us, and that's essentially what they did to us. Well, they did to God. By turning their backs on God, they were saying, look, we don't need God because we have friends in high places. We have friends in the White House. We have friends in Shushan. So we're not afraid to celebrate the death of Judaism, the death of the Jewish God, the death of Jeremiah and his prophecy, because we have friends who care about us, who invite us into the royal palace. So God says, okay, you don't need me. Fine. Carry on without me. And let's see how you manage with your new friends, right? Let's see how the sheep manages with her new friends, the 70 wolves, right? And we see how that panned out. So the question Rob is asking, so why then were the Jews worthy of redemption? And this is exactly the point where I think I said this yesterday, that on that night, the king, the sleep of the king was aroused. The king was aroused from his slumber. And Chassidus explained that the reference here is to God the king. On that night, which means a state of double darkness. It was not only night, a state of darkness, spiritual darkness, but it was that night, not this night, which means a double darkness, a double state of spiritual comatose. The people were so far removed from this spiritual observance that they didn't even know what they didn't even know. They completely lost the plot. So even though it was a very, very dark spiritual night, and therefore God had every reason to turn his back on us, nevertheless, the sleep of the king was stirred. The fact that God woke up without being initiated by us, but rather by him intervening at the 11th hour, that is the Purim story. That actually was despite us, not because us, that God intervened. And that's why you're supposed to raise your voice when you read the Megillah at the beginning of chapter 5, at the beginning of this point, yeah?
The Jews had merit because they fasted. And they repented.
So that's an interesting question, but I don't think, hang on, did that happen?
Sure.
Did that happen earlier or later? The fasting?
Before.
Okay, so I'm in the middle of a discourse. I'm in the middle of learning a discourse from the Rebbe in 1965, where he's asking that exact question. So I don't know the answer to it yet. The Rebbe brings the Alter Rebbe who says that God woke up despite the spiritual slumber of the Jewish people, but then he brings a question from the previous Rebbe who says exactly your question, Andy, that it was the self-sacrifice of the Jews at that time that seems to have aroused God. So which one was it? Was it the Jewish people in a state of slumber, or was it the Jewish people in a state of arousal? So I don't know the answer to that question, but I am working on it from the Rebbe's discourse in 1965. Yeah.
How's it God aroused? God's always up.
No, it's not true. You're coming with preconceived notions,
Okay.
and you did the same mistake yesterday. That Chassidus teaches us don't put God in a box. Don't put God. I'm serious. We should all not do this. Don't put God in a box. Don't create God in your image, but rather create us in his image, right? So if you're going to learn about God, people come in with notions and they say, well, God should be doing this, that, and the other for me. And if he's not, therefore I'm out. Abandon your preconceived notions. Learn Torah to learn who God is and what God does. And that's why you can't challenge the premise what the Torah is telling us. You say, well, God should be doing this. Well, where do you get that piece of information from? The answer is no, it's not. It's actually a Christian belief that you just brought up, that God should somehow always be present and always be kind and always be loving. Reminds me of when I was flying on a plane. I was like 18 years old and flying from South Africa to Israel. And there was a guy sitting next to me who was a missionary, and he thought that he's got a captive audience here as a young Jew for the next 12 hours of the flight to be able to convert him to Christianity on the way to his yeshiva. So the guy was talking and I was in no mood. Eventually, he's telling me about how God first chose the Jewish people, 613 commandments, but then they failed miserably. And he realized that it was too hard. and he gave up the Jews for another people. Gave up the Jews for another people, for the Christians, and he gave up the 613 commandments for one commandment, and that commandment was love. That's it. And that's the New Testament. So I repeated the story. I said to him, I need to understand something. So was it in the name of love that you massacred my grandparents in the Holocaust? Was it in the name of love that you massacred my ancestors in the First Crusade, the Second Crusade, and the Spanish Inquisition? You burned them at the stake? And all of the other tortures that are unspeakable throughout the Middle Ages that the Vatican and the Church did to our people, that was all in the name of love? So the guy was like, I need the bathroom. You're in the bathroom. I never saw him the rest of the flight. They had 2 seats. So my point is that don't bring your preconceived notions to the table. We're open. Our hearts are open. Our minds are open to new ideas, to new paradigms, to be able to understand God and not create God in our image. But I want to conclude with one closing point, guys. In those days and in these days, it's fun to read the story in hindsight and say, well, you see, they got the 70 years wrong. And if only Belshazzar knew, ha ha ha, right? And the same thing with Achashverosh, ha ha ha, he got it wrong. And it was Darius II. He's the guy, because they should have known. Well, guess what? There's another prophecy at play today. And most of the Jews are comatose to it, are asleep to it. There's a prophecy of redemption. The Rebbe is the prophet of our generation, and he promised us that Mashiach is coming very, very soon. He promised us that the best days of our lives are about to happen at any moment in time. He actually said that it makes no sense. In 1991, right after Pesach, 1991, he says, Kolu kol hakitzin. He says all calculations as to when Mashiach should come, the redemption, the Mashiach should come, have all passed. All signs, all codes, all perpetuous times, every single one of them has passed, and it makes zero sense why Mashiach is not here yet. It's got to be that he's just going to be here at any instant. Now, we can approach this with one of two ways. We can either turn a cold shoulder and say, whatever. Or we can say, I'm going to be one of the wise men. I'm going to be one of the believers. Because every other prophecy in Jewish history, by the way, has come true. Just saying. Every single other prophecy in Jewish history has come true. And if you doubt that, the fact that you're still here is proof of that. Right? So the fact that the Jewish people have survived to tell the tale is proof of the fact that every single prophecy has come true. And even when we were on the precipice of genocide, like in the Purim story, God intervened and still saved us, true to his prophecy. So right now we're at the cusp of a prophecy, which, by the way, is already being fulfilled in so many ways. When we learn about flying on the wings of eagles to the Holy Land, we understand that. When we understand about that, there'll be no more illness. There'll be no more illness is what it says. You know what that means? No more illness? Well, there's all sorts of diseases being cured every single day. Illness, the deafness, there's blindness, there's Alzheimer's. They're coming out with cures left, right, and center. We're seeing the fulfillment of these prophecies. The eradication of poverty. We're seeing all sorts of fascinating programs and endowments and government initiatives that are curing and solving problems all over the world. We are living in the fulfillment of biblical times. And friends, the Rebbe said to us, don't be caught asleep. Don't be caught asleep. Even though your brother or your sister-in-law might be making fun of you and saying, oh, you're becoming all religious. What did the rabbi do to you? You're drinking the Kool-Aid. Ignore the scoffers, folks. Ignore. Jewish history is filled with Jewish people who had the strength to stand up to the scoffers. Let's not make that mistake of becoming one of the scoffers or being intimidated by those who mock us. Let's be the ones that make things happen instead of the ones that watch things happen. We saw those miracles happen against all odds. Can you imagine what the stamina of the Jewish people must have been like after Belshazzar's feast? Can you imagine what the hope of the Jewish people must have felt like during Achashverosh's feast? They actually surrendered. They said, here we are, God has abandoned us, and we are pledging allegiance to Achashverosh. That's what they said, because they actually believed that the prophecy was dead, that the God of Israel was dead. But it took those few Jews, Mordechai and his few men, who were able to stand strong. These were the ones who were able to turn the tide. And history was always, the revolutions of history always happened, not through large groups of people, but through small groups of inspired men and women.
Torah portion, with the golden calf.
The golden calf too, yes, it's a big topic. I want to go into that right now, but I want to say it's small groups of inspired people that change the world, and we can be those people that's been inspired by the lessons of our history to make a difference, to bring Mashiach now.